Welcome to One World Stories. My name is Joanna Zell, and I'm really happy to welcome a very precious guest of mine, Joel Brown, who comes originally from the United States. We personally met in Europe in different locations.
Mhm.
And whenever we met, it was a very big eye opening. Why? Because Joel is a storyteller. He is really a born storyteller. He is a poet. He is also a professor in storytelling at the different universities in the United States, but also in Europe, for example, in France. And what is really spectacular about Joel is that he has got a huge passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is where he applies working with stories. A very warm welcome, Joel.
Thank you. As always, it's good to see you. I think we met, we were definitely kindred spirits. My regret is that we don't get to see each other more often. And hopefully, we'll be able to see each other soon, depending on how things finish and complete themselves with the pandemic. So it's a pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to see you and glad to be here.
I'm happy that you are here, that you have time for us, and that you are eager to share also how you actually work with stories. So let us jump immediately into the middle of sharing stories. How did this adventure start for you?
Well, if you're thinking or talking personally, I've always just enjoyed story. And I remember my second grade teacher, her name was Miss Petros, and she asked us to do an assignment, and it was about storytelling. And I wrote this story about, and this was at the age of 7, uh, aliens coming to Earth and seeing how automated we had become and how machine dependent we had become, and that the aliens saw us and thought how weird we were because we didn't seem to really embrace our humanity. Now, I didn't say it in that way at the age of 7, but that was what I was writing about. And I remember Miss Petros saying, "You have a gift, you need to develop it, you should do this more." So I started really enjoying writing poetry, and I've always enjoyed writing and sharing stories. As I got older, stories were the way that I was able to make sense of the world around me. They were the way that I was allowed or able to find peace, not only as an indigenous man in the United States, as an African American man, but also as a gay man. So, on all those three levels, it became an important tool for me just to get my voice out to express my feelings. And I think at the same time, when I meet people, and I think, you and I had this experience, I'm always curious to hear and learn about other people's stories. And I think, once again, going to my younger years, my mother always encouraged us to get to know people. And she always said, anybody I bring home is someone who you should look at as family. And it didn't matter where they were from, what they looked like, but they were family. And implicit in that was this notion of hearing in their stories and getting to know them. So I always love sitting around listening to the stories from my grandparents, the stories from my uncles and aunts, the stories from my parents, but also the stories from these new wonderful strangers who talked about the different things that they saw in their lives, whether it was where they grew up or the food that they ate or the families that they grew up in. And so it just became something that it to me reinforced how important story was on so many different levels, not only in terms of my interaction with other people, in terms of how I saw the world, but also in terms of my creativity. And it just continued to grow where, I wrote poems, I wrote short stories, and I'm always interested in hearing short stories. And as you know, sometimes when you meet people, the first thing they want to know is, what do you do? And I find that to not be as interesting as learning who are they and how did they become the person who they are. And because of their stories, what is it that they want to do in the world, or how is it that they want to operate within the world? So story has always been a very fundamental piece of my life. I know it will be that way for from now until I return to the dust, as they say. I just naturally love story. And I think there's always an art to when you share and how you share and how much you share. But I think that's what connects people.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, when I listen to you, I also have to go back to a childhood memory. As a little girl, I still remember that I got two different sets of stories. One set of stories was the official one behind the Iron Curtain, the
Mm,
politics, and actually already right now I'm just reading George Orwell,
mm,
1984, and it's really like, oh wow, how is it possible that he predicted all this? What was so insane? And the second set of stories was the one home, where I heard, of course, don't tell anyone. This is the real history, so to
right.
say. However, don't share it. So it's also what you are just addressing, very very tricky, because as I see it, working with stories, sharing stories is very very much culture specific. So I really had to learn to use my voice, that this voice is heard, because somewhere deep inside there was this tiny girly voice. Hey, maybe it's not really the story the world needs to hear because it's not conform.
Mm.
Do you think that the storytelling is really culture bound?
I do. I think cultures and societies themselves are based upon stories. The stories we tell themselves, the story we tell ourselves, the story that people tell themselves, the stories that we tell about each other, the aspirational stories of who we want to be. What you shared resonated with me because part of the storytelling for me too was recognizing the narrative of how I was to operate in society and to recognize that society in many ways had different rules for different people. There's a story of how the US operates, and I'm sure for many people outside of the US, there's a narrative. And then there's a narrative of how I've actually viewed it living in the United States, which is different. Or in some ways, it is consistent with how people have viewed the US. I think there's a narrative of how um, of what the different lives have been. I mean, I think that's why you've seen, for example, the focus on, let's just say, as an example, Black Lives Matter, because these stories have not been given visibility, or these stories have not been honored, and these stories have not been given the due respect. And there's been one prevailing narrative of what the US is. And I can tell you, every time I travel, people are always surprised to know that I'm an American because in their minds, they have a story, the
Mm.
story of how an American looks, how they talk, how they act, how they engage. And for many reasons, there are people who will look at me and engage me, and they'll tell me, well, you're not what I expected. I didn't expect you to identify as an American, either because of how I look and my color, my racial identity, or because of how I engage, because there's a narrative. And I understand why people think this way, that Americans are self absorbed or they're rude or they're not in open to other cultures. I think there's obviously people who have probably fit that stereotype. I hope that we are doing a better job of looking outward and not just inward. And also because of a number of things. And, for example, the African American story, the gay American story, the indigenous story is going to be different. And so part of what I love to do when I travel is to help people have a more rich and complex view of what the US is and what people are, because we're all many stories. And of course, the story that a person may hear about me or what they may believe to be my story is probably going to be different than what the story actually is. And that's why interculturalism and travel and engagement is so important, is because there's so much that you can learn now from books and news and media and newspapers, but from just talking to other people that might challenge, expand, and shift how people view the world and how we can start to deconstruct these stories to say, well, okay, this is an additional perspective that I didn't have before. Maybe this story is one that is not as true as I thought it was. And maybe this story can be even bigger, greater, and have more detail based on my interactions with different people.
Mm, yeah, yeah, yes, and I'm really grateful for what you have just shared in terms of intersectionality, which is the term from diversity and inclusion context. That very, very often we tend to reduce one person to just one story. Let's say this one stereotype. And of course, intersectionality shows us that it's a set of stories, and we need to have eyes opened to all of them. And when I look at also at your CV, this is something you haven't mentioned so far. Is also, this huge, really rich background of searching for knowledge and really this being thirsty for knowledge. So, with studying political sciences, later on law, and also having the PhD, this is also one of the layers of stories. So how does this intersectionality can, so to say, help us work with stories in a better way?
I think intersectionality in particular helps us to recognize that what we may think of as the only story is really just one side of a larger story. So, what do I mean by that? To go back to what I talked about before, there's an American narrative and story, and there are many different elements to it that I think need to be further explored. Just like that would, and it would be the same case in any other country. If you're looking at the story of women, if you're looking at the story of other minorities, if you're looking at the stories of people who perhaps have been historically underrepresented or oppressed, or just looking at things from a different angle. So, for example, if we're looking at different regions of the world, and right now, of course, there's a lot of conflict taking place in what we term the Middle East. And there's one narrative. And I think there's also important to make sure that we're looking at the narratives on all sides to make sure that we have a balanced view and perspective of what's taking place. I would also say to what you mentioned in terms of the different uh, things I've studied and the knowledge I pursue, the different ways in which I've been educated. There's different levels or different ways of presenting the story, right? So I think when I first started my career, I thought that the way that we could explain story and that we could share story was just looking at law. But then I realized at some point that law by itself doesn't completely explain and help to build a narrative of how we can be better. And so you have to look at things at different levels. And so within any story, there's a human dynamic. When you work with organizations, there's a business dynamic, there's a personal dynamic, there's a social justice dynamic, there's a global dynamic, there's an intercultural dynamic. There's so many different things. And so part of what I like to do is maybe, and I think as part of my own educational and just learning journey, is to revisit things and think about how I can look at them differently with a different lens. So if we're studying, for example, the experiment known as democracy, or if we're studying a different country or cultural context, there's many different layers of how you could look at that one situation. It depends on what type of lens are you using, what type of glasses are you using. And that is for me what has not only helped me and motivated me in my journey, but I would also say that when we think about how we listen to other people's stories, we can also use different earpieces to say, okay, I mean, I can hear it from this level, whatever the story is, but there might be something different. So, for example, when you study law, once again, you can look at it from the standpoint of rules and regulations and laws. But what I really like to get to when I'm thinking about cultures and ecosystems is how people are impacted, like the people who are going to be the faces of these new restrictions or these new laws or these new movements. How are they impacted? What are their stories? And I think that's the way in which storytelling can really be useful, is thinking about what's the best way to hear a story and to offer a different perspective, and to recognize that people have different layers of sharing story and people have different layers of receiving story. And so when I'm doing work and when I'm engaging people, we can be very academic and we can talk about philosophy and politics and law. But ultimately, what I have found in my time is that the most influential way to connect with people is to talk from the heart, and to hear about personal experiences that can help you to understand more of where they're coming from and how you might be able to coexist together, in the same world, in the same region, in the same community. So there's so much that we could talk about based on that question. But for me, that's what I think about in terms of intersectionality, both from a cultural standpoint, but also from a pedagogical standpoint, of recognizing that stories are layered and stories are multidimensional, and people have different ways of receiving and hearing stories. And we have to attune ourselves to recognize that sometimes the way we may have described or shared or talked about something, there could be a different way of describing the same thing that might be more resonant with the other person. And there might be ways in which they can share it that might be more resonant with you as well.
Definitely, definitely. Before we share a story, we need to know exactly who is listening to, because this is also, this beauty of giving the gift of story to someone, that if we really intend to offer it as a gift, we want that the message comes across, that this unwrapping takes place, and not that
Exactly.
it's just boxed. And this is pretty tempting sometimes, when I listened to you, especially in the academic context, that there is this very hermeneutic language. And yes, this is, of course, the danger that this story doesn't get unwrapped and doesn't come across. Definitely,
Absolutely.
yes. And actually, currently, we see many narratives like that, that they are intended not really to be fully understood.
Exactly. Exactly. There are many narratives that, based on who's in power, who has influence, that are not necessarily shared. And then also recognizing that sometimes the way stories are delivered, there can be a bias in terms of how we deliver them and um, how they are shared. And so I always am trying to think about that. And when I'm working with students or clients, or even when I'm just talking to people, I think about what's the best way that I can engage this person so that they can receive my story. I also have to think about what is the most effective way for me to tell the story, because sometimes stories have to be modified and they have to be presented in a different format for them to be heard. I mean, so that's where all the intercultural considerations come into play as well. And I think ultimately, though, what I have found does work is that when you build the trust and the rapport and the safety, and you create the space, um, which is, of course, not always easy work, then you can share stories in such a way where you can really get to the heart of things, and you can really get to the heart of people, and you can see dynamics shift because people see you more, and they see more of your humanity, and you can see more of their humanity. Because I think that's the healing aspect of what stories do, is help us to affirm each other's humanity. And what we have to do, though, of course, is deal with these complex organs, and deal with the brain and the ear, and and get past our own biased understanding of things in order to get to that place. And so much of the work is about peeling back certain layers, but also making sure that stories are shared in such a way so that the person can really be fully open and present for them. And sometimes that is academic, and most times I find that it is relational. how do you connect with the other person in such a way that they can really hear it? And if you do that, then you have a wonderful thing that you can share between people.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I still remember, when we also had the pleasure to meet each other in Paris. Uh, Back then, actually, I offered also a workshop on storytelling for leaders. You were offering immediately afterwards the workshop on story listening. And I, of course, joined out of curiosity. And it was really like a big, big gift because you offered a very powerful activity regarding the story listening part. And this is how a very, very beautiful friendship got established between a very dear friend of mine and myself.
Mm,
And when you were just talking about this connectivity, that it's also about building relations, this is exactly the point that sometimes we can underestimate the power of what is happening. And especially when we really manage to create such a space where people want to share authentic stories, not just one or two stories that don't really matter and are repeated for the X time, then it can be really the beginning of a wonderful relationship. What?
I don't know any relationship I have where we haven't been able to get to the story, and that's maybe my bend. And that's, how I distinguish between, friends and perhaps acquaintances is, have I made space to share stories? And that doesn't, and of course, all of us are vessels for thousands of stories, right? Where none of us are, is just one story. And at the same time, if there is, um, when stories can be shared and they can be shared openly, honestly, and freely, then I just think it takes your relationship to a new level. It means, and it creates an opportunity to do greater things. So for me, that is the thing that I look for when I'm connecting with people. And it's not something that I'm even conscious of. It's just part of who I am. Is at some point, and stories can be funny, they can be lighthearted, they can be a number of things. But is there a way for us to connect at a heart to heart level and a soul to soul level? That's what's really important for me. And when I do that, then I know that there's an opportunity for something really great. And those friendships that I have been based on and built on the fact that there's a constant sharing of stories, there's a constant openness, there's a trust there for me to be completely open about, here's where I am, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm seeing, and this is what I've experienced. Where would the world be without our stories? And at the same time, our world is a product of various stories being shared and once again disseminated and sometimes manipulated. And so story exists all around us. And so much of our work, as you know, I don't have to tell you, is about recognizing our own story, but also understanding and recognizing the stories that exist around us and asking questions, ensuring curiosity, and further deconstructing what's there to see what exactly is at the heart of how people engage, how people interact, and how societies have been built. So, on so many levels, storytelling is such a rich and powerful thing, and a concept that I think we don't give enough attention to because we simply see the stories as just being universal truths, and there's no universality. There's just a different experience or approach to looking at things, which is why also this work is so important from an intercultural standpoint. I find each year, as I get older, I'm constantly thinking about stories in a new and different way, and I'm thinking less about telling my own story, but also about listening and saying, okay, what's going on there, and what is it that the person is sharing with me, and where is there an opportunity to connect, and also what's the purpose person's motivation, and what are the core um, beliefs that inform the story that they offer. You can learn a lot about people, organizations, cultures, the world just by listening and listening at many different levels to see what their beliefs are, what their experiences have been, what their feelings have been, what facts they're offering. All of that is compressed, condensed, and included in story.
Mhm. So, Joel, what is the story that actually helped you in these turbulent times? You know that the series is called One Word Story, so I'm asking for this one word. However, what is really important? What is the story behind?
Well, the word for me is vulnerability. And I'm going to share a story from a time before that I had to remember during this past 14, 15 months. So I remember when I was first starting my business, this was 16 years ago. It was a very exciting time, it was a very difficult time because I had lost my job. I had gotten fired from a legal job, and I had to think about how was I going to eat, how was I going to take care of myself. And I remember I had an air purifier, which in these days probably is a highly coveted thing. But I was so desperate for money. I remember I went to this pawn shop. So in the US, we have shops where you can sell items that you own and get money for them. And there's one person who inspects the items to see if they're in good shape. And then they give you some money, and they probably end up then selling the item at a higher cost because they want to make sure that they get some money. So I had an air purifier, and I thought, well, I don't have much use for this. I'm going to take it to the pawn shop. I get to the pawn shop, and the pawn shop was in an urban area. It was a working class neighborhood. Primarily, I would say it was actually pretty diverse, but it was working class. So not middle class and certainly not rich. And so I came in there, and if you go to a pawn shop, they're used to people selling jewelry, things that have, I would say, more obvious value. So I come in there having walked 3 blocks with this air purifier, and it was hot. And, so I carry this thing that's a little awkward, and it's tall, it's like 4 feet tall, or um, maybe a meter and a half. And the guy looks at me, and he says, well, what are you selling? I said, I want to see how much I can get for this air purifier. And he looked at me, and I'll never forget, he said, in this part of the city, because I was living in Kansas City at the time, he said, people don't care about having clean air. In fact, the idea of having clean air is a luxury. And he said, so I can't give you anything for it. And so I went back home, and I was feeling deflated and defeated and sad and worried and stressed because once again, I needed money. And I remember a friend calling me and asked me what I had done that day. And I told them that what had happened. And they just said, well, why don't you come over for dinner? And, I went over for dinner. And then the next day they asked me over for dinner. And then the next day and the next day. Until it became a regular thing because they knew that I was having trouble at that time just finding enough food to eat. And so at some point, what the friend and I had a conversation, and what they shared with me was that they wanted to support me, but they didn't know that things had gotten to such a point where I was only eating 2 meals a day because, but they realized how serious things were because I was sitting there trying to sell an air purifier at a pawn shop in an area where people are not buying air purifiers. That's just not something that they seek out. So what I took from that time, which was, like I said, about 16, 17, probably 18 years ago, was how important it is to be vulnerable with people who you trust and to not suffer in silence. And I think this past year, as wonderful as it has been in some instances to work from home, to enjoy the quiet, to have less traffic, it's also been a very difficult year for a lot of us. And for me, the biggest thing that I've had to deal with over the past year has been isolation and loneliness because most of my family is back east. And so, for those of you who are not in the United States, our country spans the continent. which I forget because I live here until I take a plane or a flight back east. And I realize, okay, it's 6 hours. I've been on the plane and I'm just now landing in this new place. And you forget how big the country is. Well, the closest family that I have is about 4 hours away by plane. Four, not by car, not by bus, not by train, but by plane. So that means it's a long ways away. And when people ask me how I was doing, there's the standard answer of, oh, yes, I'm fine. You put on the happy face and you just go about your day. But I really started to be honest with people and say, on the days when I felt sad, I'm struggling, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling depressed, I'm lonely, I feel isolated. And the wonderful thing in doing that was that you start to realize the depth and the quality of the friendships that you do have. I had a friend who, for example, would call me every Friday night because he knew Friday nights were difficult just to check on me. I had other friends who would call and reach out. And then, we do video chats. So we do video dinners. And the greatest gift sometimes that you can give your friends and your family is the story of what's really going on with you. And what I mean by that is to be vulnerable. And by doing that, then you get to change, at least I was able to change the narrative. And I didn't feel as isolated. I didn't feel as lonely. I didn't feel as um, stressed and sad because I realized I actually had people who I could count on who may not have been here physically, but they were there emotionally. Just like this situation with the air purifier. But you have to take the risk and you have to, where you feel comfortable, share the story and be open about how you feel. That's how I've survived this past year. It's not been from reading posts and you get all these newsletters of 5 great things to this and 7 great things to this and 3 good things that you can do. I think it really comes from just simply saying, at times, I need help, or sometimes just saying, I need to share this part of myself, and it may not be all pretty and put together. Those can be just as compelling as any other story that you might share. And I think sometimes when we think about story and storytelling, it's become this commodity of something that's slick and perfect. And stories represent life, and life is not always perfect. And the best stories sometimes are not the ones that are well curated and perfect and slick, but the ones that are honest and vulnerable and come from the heart. And that's how I've been able to really, I think, uh, not only survive this year, but to emerge on the other side and feel like I'm transformed, like I'm actually better than I was entering, or I feel better because I'm clear about who's my friendships. I think I have invested more in my relationships, and I found the space and the wisdom and the power and the courage to be open and to say, let me just be open about who I am and what I'm dealing with, despite what you might see on LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook. And that is a powerful thing when you let go of the idea of who you have to be, and you just allow people to see who you are, and you use that as a way of building a deeper relationship. And as you do that, you find that other people also want to build tighter relationships too.
I'm very grateful for your sharing, because this is also what I observe not only in the outside world, but also in my own, that we are very, very much into sharing stories when everything is okay. And this is actually also what happened last year in my case, because, it was just one afternoon in winter. Actually, before the whole pandemic started, we had a student from Peru, an exchange student, a wonderful girl. And my mom called me, and she called me and she said, "Oh, do you have a minute?" I said,
Mm,
"Yes, of course. Yeah, sure. What's going on?" "Yeah, I need to tell you something. Unfortunately, it's not, I don't have good news. I've got cancer." And this was really the moment when I felt completely speechless. I listened to her, I didn't interrupt her. She told me everything about the therapy, about what she has, ahead, and what's going on. And of course, I shared it home. Of course, I shared it also with the exchange student, with Giovanna. But then, it was really, really hard to share it with people, especially during the pandemics, because in the pandemics, everybody was so much into their own trouble, so
Mm,
to say, that I remember when my mom struggled with all this. All in all, I decided to send her one picture a day. This was how we stayed in touch, because after seeing this picture, after also reading the short description, also reading a question I asked her to answer, we had a conversation every single day. And I still remember when she got operated and the operation was good, and she heard that she doesn't need any chemotherapy, which was really, really, uh, you know, important.
mm,
This was the moment when I really, felt like, whew, right now I can share what has happened. So this was
mm,
really the moment when I really wrote the message to different people. I really laugh, So we have gone through the worst.
mm.
But back then, and this is also, this that comes to my head, how we are dealing with different situations, that it's so obvious to us to share stories, or sometimes it's so obvious to us not to share. And yeah, this is also, something that comes to my head, especially in this context of working with stories, that sometimes, and this is what I understood during the pandemics, and because of the situation, people are not ready to share. And we need to create such a space where these people also feel hosted.
Mhm.
And this is the last question I have for you, actually. How can we create such a space where people simply feel this psychological safety, and feel that it doesn't really matter whether they share story verbally, or sometimes just, I don't know, with the body language or with tears, that it's okay.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for sharing that story, because I remember you indicating that, and um, for you to share that is an act of courage. And I also wish, as a friend, I had done more to support you during that. And part of that is wondering, how much is too much? Do you check in? How much does a person want to talk about it? What I would share is, I think we just have to be role models. I'm Instead of telling other people what they could or should do, sometimes it's a matter of just being the very thing that you want to see in the world, and hoping that by doing or being that very thing, that people also will see the benefit of it. I can tell you, in the past year, by virtue of me opening up and saying, hey, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling isolated, people have shared with me how grateful they've been, because it's given them license and permission to open up.
Mm,
I can speak for other cultural contexts, but I work in France. I live in the U.S. I've studied in Costa Rica, and I do wonder sometimes if there is such an overemphasis on positivity. And don't get me wrong, I'm an optimist. I'm the person who sees the glass half full, not half empty. But there is also such a thing called toxic positivity, where we are so focused on being something, doing something, and a lot of that's because of social media, that we dismiss the fact that it's okay to talk about things that are uncomfortable or things that are not negative. And so what happens in toxic positivity is someone brings something up and people will say, oh, things will be better, don't you worry, or don't be negative, or people have this aversion or this discomfort with things that are negative. And my thing to people is, by virtue of being a storyteller, and recognizing and being present with all of my stories, I feel healthier than I would if I didn't. I mean, I always used to joke that some people go to psychologists, some people may take antidepressants, and the rest of us use story. And that's how we can able to deal with things because you open up and you talk about it. So I think we have to be role models. And I will say that by virtue of me being open, I'll never forget, for example, I wrote a letter to my sister and explained to my sister and my brother that I was feeling a little depressed. And my sister actually thanked me. I will never forget that. She actually thanked me and said, "Thank you for trusting me with what's going on, but also for showing me some vulnerability because, by you opening up, it makes it easier for me to open up."
Mm.
And so I would just encourage people to take more risk and share a little bit more. And, it doesn't always have to be glamorous. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be always positive. It just can be just be vulnerable. And I think hopefully if we've learned nothing else from the past 14, 15 months, is that we create more space for each other to be human and to be open about how we have felt. Because that's what I want in my life. I don't want people to feel like they can't share, and I don't want to have relationships where I feel like I can't share. That's something that's really important to me, no matter what it is, that people are able to tell me, "How are you?" And so now when I talk to people in if I'm feeling good, you'll hear me say, "I'm great." And if I'm not, I'll say, "Hey, I'm having a tough day." And it's not because I need someone else to solve it for me. It's just a way of me being able to show up honestly and authentically with that person. And it's a way in which I just want to live my life. And so it's not something I had to learn, but it's something I had to remember. And there's been a lot of strength, I would say, in being vulnerable. And I think I don't think, I know my relationships have increased, or I shouldn't say increased, but they have expanded dramatically because I've trusted that person to let them know how I'm doing and how I'm feeling. And that's what it really is about. When you role model storytelling and vulnerable storytelling, what you're basically saying to that person is that I not only trust you to hold space for my story, but I also am investing in this friendship to take it to another level. And what a wonderful thing now in 2021 to create that space so that our relationships, not our transactions, not our shopping and not our consumerism, not our social media, but for our relationships to grow. So that's the biggest lesson for me from 2020 is vulnerability.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel. What do you wish for yourself and for your beloved ones for the second half of 2021?
Uh, I would say physical health, and I would say for the world. Um, I hope that we don't rush back into a false sense of normalcy. I hope we take time to say that let's reevaluate what normal and healthy is, and let's make our reality that as opposed to what it was in March of 2020. I don't think that reality served a lot of people. And I hope that we now know, based on what we've been through the past year and a half, that we can transform our reality to make it more of what feels right and perfect for us.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you, Joel.